Right, everyone, shall we get started then? Welcome to this event on British foreign policy. Our times are changing. I'm Federica Bicchi, Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations, and I'm delighted to see all of you here to discuss all things British foreign policy, really. This event is sponsored by the Department of International Relations, as well as by NewDip, a research project Ben Tonra and I are running on relations between Ireland and the UK and funded by the ESLC and IRC. We gratefully acknowledge the funding. It is also supported by the European Foreign Policy Unit of LSE, of which I am the new director, and which aims to foster a conversation about the foreign policy of European countries, including the UK. When I thought of this title last summer, I was wondering to what extent times were really changing. The Brexit referendum had dramatically shifted the UK's set of political partners, and the government was promoting a narrative about global Britain, reaching out beyond Europe. Thanks to a group of talented postgraduate students, we mapped British foreign policy vis-à-vis key partners beyond Europe, from India to Russia to Hong Kong. But the bottom line was that global Britain was more of an aspiration than a reality. And you can read the 10 papers on the European Foreign Policy Unit website and make up your mind. But yes, there was the transformation of Foreign Office into the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office with the disbandment of DFID. But it has not been clear how this new organization and the government aim to deliver on the goals set out by the integrated review of security, defense, development and foreign aid that the British government published in March 2021. It looked as if the UK was going to project its power in the Indo-Pacific, both militarily and in terms of alliances, like in the much mentioned and now partly forgotten AUKUS treaty with Australia and the United States. Today, with Russia's brutal aggression of Ukraine going on as we speak, there is a need for clarity in terms of what British foreign policy stands for. What are the values that the UK is trying to defend, trying to promote, and how is it trying to do it? Is the UK better outside the EU in terms of positioning itself, setting its own goals, or is it even more exposed to the vagaries of international politics? To what extent does the new security architecture in Europe suit the UK in terms of, for instance, in the field of cyber? And are relations between the UK and the Republic of Ireland finally out of their recent rocky patch? To discuss all this and more, I'm joined by a great panel of experts. We have Richard Whitman, who is a Professor of Politics and International Relations at the Global Europe Centre, University of Kent. Richard currently holds the British Academy and Leverhulme Michael Dockrell Senior Research Fellowship in British Foreign Policy and has published widely on the foreign, security and defence policies of the UK and the EU. Dr. Kate Ferguson is a senior policy analyst specializing in violence prevention. She is co-executive director at Protection Approaches, where she heads research and policy. She is currently special advisor to the Parliamentary Select Committee on International Development, assisting in their ongoing inquiry on the UK's approach to atrocity prevention. Her book, Architectures of Violence, was published in 2020 for Hearst and Oxford University Press. Last but not least, Ben Tonra is full professor of international relations at the School of Politics and International Relations of the University College Dublin, with a long list of publications on European foreign affairs, especially on matters related to security and defense. So welcome to the three of you, and let's get started. Let's start with an overview of what you see out there in terms of British foreign policy after Brexit. What are the main characteristics that you see emerging in British foreign policy? What are the continuities? What are the changes in British foreign policy? And what evidence is there, if any, of global Britain? Shall we start with Richard and then move on to Kate and Ben? Richard.
Thank you very much, Federica, and thank you for this this event, because I think it's fantastically chosen in terms of timing. I think if we think about the characteristics of UK foreign policy post-Brexit, I mean, everything's still, I think, a work in progress. And I think that's to be expected because, you know, in leaving the EU, you had a major transformation from what had been the key organizing basis for the UK's international influence. And, you know, that relationship with the EU had been a key organizing device for the UK's relationship with other European states, members of the EU, but it was an important fulcrum, I think, for the UK's approach to seeking influence in Europe and beyond Europe, and especially important for transatlantic relations. So, you know, this is a major order structural change, and I think a structural change of that magnitude is not something that the UK is going to adjust itself from swiftly. And as you said quite rightly in your introduction, we had this idea of global Britain, a sort of placeholder idea, which was pretty thin in terms of substance, but I think we've got a little bit more added to that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Perhaps it's also worth thinking about whether we can draw a distinction between UK foreign policy from around June 2016 until 18 months ago, you know, when the major order preoccupation was the negotiations with the EU, and clearly that was a key foreign policy objective for the UK. Is there a shift? Have we seen an acceleration, if you like, of a new patterns within UK foreign policy over the last 14 months, sort of post trade and cooperation agreement signed, post integrated review, which is now 12 months on? Are we sort of starting to see more by way of substance when it comes to global Britain? Well, maybe, but I think I draw a distinction between the UK's European foreign policy, which I think remains somewhat emaciated, if I could put it that way. And you've got some key bilateral relationships, such as those with Ireland and France, which are, I would see, really being subject of a casual disregard. I mean, that's classic British understatement, I would say, which is pretty extraordinary when you consider their importance for the UK as neighbours. So, the European foreign policy, I think, is not really coming into focus to the degree that one should expect of a European power like the UK. If you look beyond Europe, I mean, there are some relationships where clearly they've taken on a bit more muscle. If you look at the relationship with Japan, for example, you know, where there's a sort of burgeoning security dialogue. You know, the UK is quite pleased to have been accepted as an ASEAN dialogue partner, and that's quite important for the story that Britain wants to tell itself, or tell about itself rather, in terms of the tilt. But some other key relationships for the UK, like the transatlantic relationship, feel rather brittle to me. I mean, notwithstanding the war on Ukraine, you know, which does create a requirement for enhanced cooperation, with deep cooperation, it just seems to be a relationship where the UK is still very much not connected in the way that historically it's been. And I think, as you touched on in your introduction, there have clearly been some major order restructuring arrangements in terms of the creation of the FCTO. And if we think about resources as well, allocation of resources, crudely, I mean, the government has taken a decision to spend less on development, more on defence. And that's, you know, that is a major order change. Three things I want to bring into the discussion really briefly, and we can come back to these, as what I see real characteristics for me, standout characteristics of what the UK has done in a sort of global Britain foreign policy. One is there's a major preoccupation with status or with standing. And you see that quite a lot coming out with the negotiations with the EU, particularly on the TCA, where there's this preoccupation with what I call a kind of assertive sovereigntism, putting the concern to be treated as an equal ahead of perhaps what might have been a more considered calculation of the UK's best interests. And that's very much flowed into the way that the UK approached things like the G7 presidency and the COP, and lead to quite a sort of hyperactivity, I would say, within NATO. Secondly, I think the UK is rather enamored with the idea now of what I call venue shopping. It's going to different places to seek to replace, in a way, or to replicate some of the things it did with the EU previously. So G7, UN Security Council, NATO, none of which are a replication or a replacement. And we've seen, new propositions such as Five Eyes, which has been brought together on Hong Kong, and a bit of a stress on the Quad with the UK, France, Germany, and the US. But it's interesting that where it's done this venue shopping, there are also places where I think it's been very unsuccessful. The E3, I think, which is something that UK put some store by as being an alternative way of perhaps backseat driving on European foreign policy, hadn't really worked out for the UK in the way that might have hoped it would. And the Commonwealth also, you remember all of that chat about, Commonwealth 2.0 and so on and so on. That hasn't really worked for the UK. But lastly, I think it's worth thinking about, this will be where I'll shut up, is what I call a sort of propensity towards plurilateralism in Europe. And by that, I mean that the British government is gradually setting out a whole series of bilateral, trilateral relationships with countries. We saw that Ukraine, Poland, UK trilateral format, for example. There's a lot of stress being put on the Joint Expeditionary Force, the 10-nation JEF that we could come back to later. And in a way, its approach towards Ukraine was part of this sort of pattern of seeking out new kinds of bilateral relationships, which maybe flags up some kind of a new emergent European strategy, but I think very, 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 very embryonic.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, we will come back to the issue of Ukraine, but before we zoom in on the very present, Kate, would you like to have the floor?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And yes, thanks so much for having me here, join you, and also convening this conversation. It feels a kind of quite difficult time to have a conversation about something I suspect all of us on this call have been thinking about for, some years, but it's brought the consequences of the last few years into focus in a really dramatic way over recent weeks. I think looking back, though, that period since the Brexit referendum, I'd characterize UK's foreign policy as essentially being sort of opportunities and promises yet unmet. And without really a kind of strategy or explanation as to why. And, I speak from a position of working within human rights and looking at the UK contributions to human rights and especially the prevention of violence abroad. And, as a sector, there was some real skepticism around, if that's another British understatement there, around the referendum. It was really quite painful. But there was also an opportunity to reset. There was an opportunity around what an independent foreign policy separate from the EU or more separate could look like. And so far, I don't think whether in messaging, whether in funding, whether in restructuring, whether in communication, has been clear. So I think that the last few years have really been dominated, I think, by a lack of clarity and an inconsistency. And I take Richard's point around the fact that this is a big reset and will take some time. But I think it has been difficult to really see where those endeavors have been going. I think the other thread really of the last few years is a smaller Britain, not a more global Britain. And I say that from the sector that I work in and the foreign diplomats that I and my team and my partners work with. Britain is seen as smaller, less serious, and more inward looking. The reputation for UK foreign policy that was always contested and discussed, there was never consensus, of course, particularly in the human rights field. That reputation has been damaged hugely. And the damage that was done by Brexit was not made better by the conscious attempt to engage there, but it also wasn't made better by the very rushed and quite shocking way in which DFID and FCO were merged. And I say that as someone who actually sees a lot of opportunity in that merger. It was done quite brutally, and it was pretty shocking that senior people in DFID found out the same way that I did by watching the Commons. But that translated internationally and has reverberated, I think, in quite a substantial way. And then came the development cuts. And so that tripartite, particularly in the fields that I work in, has really had an impact in how Britain's foreign policy is seen from elsewhere. I think if we look a bit more closely at sort of some of the detail, we also see a reluctance or a failure to reconcile or even address some of the fundamental inconsistencies that exist in UK foreign policy that have been exacerbated or have been seen to be exacerbated either by UK's exit from the European Union or by the mood of the world, wider global shifts, and other issues. I think top of those lists is a reluctance by this government to look at how it deals with Russia and China. And we had some conversation when the integrated review finally came out around the weakness of how China was talked about and the need for a China strategy. And I think the attention of the treatment of Uyghurs particularly, also of Hong Kong, has brought into focus this tension of how can the UK have a relationship with China and what does that look like? But the same was said for Russia, and the same was true for Russia, and perhaps more so because of its geopolitical positioning, of which now, of course, we are really seeing the consequences of. The consequence for what it means for UK's trade policy outside of the European Union and how that interacts with whatever British values might be, but certainly rights, freedoms, and democracy. And that hasn't been resolved. And I don't say that as if it's an easy thing to resolve, but it has been very unclear to see the intentions around seeking to resolve that. And, those four core tensions weren't addressed in the integrated review. And I don't see how steps have been taken towards that. The fifth, I think, is the political positioning of the UK within Europe and within the European Union that, again, hasn't really been resolved and actually has been really unnecessarily made more tense and more hostile. And again, we're seeing now with Ukraine some of the real consequences of that. It has damaged the relationship with the United States. And I think that Brexit and the development cuts also contributed to that break-in. I don't want to be all gloom. I do think that the integrated review promised to chart a new or renewed course. We're not here to talk about how that process was done, but we got it. It's a year in. And already we have seen even some of the more bold commitments that were set out there, like the Indo-Pacific tilt, to actually appear pretty two-dimensional and they haven't even weathered 12 months. And we're already seeing internal shifts within the FCDO of questioning whether that is in fact the right thing to do. And that points, I think, to my overarching point of this lack of strategic thinking, this lack of strategy, not ambition. Strategy doesn't have to be bold, but you do need to have some. But the integrated review did promise, particularly on that rights front, particularly on that kind of looking forward front, it promised a new approach to conflict, moving away from that approach that DFID had sometimes lent too heavily into that modern mass violence, whether armed conflict or mass atrocity crimes or widespread human rights violations, come from poverty and poor education levels. And we know this isn't true. It comes from human rights deficits. That is where modern violence comes from, and perhaps always has done. And so this new approach to conflict that opened up the recognition that it needed to prioritize specifically mass atrocities in conflict and non-conflict settings, that was important. The emphasis on resilience, both domestically and across as a whole of government understanding, and indeed a whole of society understanding of resilience, which of course, I think, we were able to kind of get that as a result of the pandemic, that matters. There was more of an indication of thinking about British foreign policy as related to domestic policy and related to people within the UK and UK borders in a manner that is needed and had previously been lacking. The integrated review has prompted a skills audit of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which is important, was needed, and I think has revealed some gaps that has helped really give the opportunity for the FCDO to think about its resources. It's looked at early warning and how the UK does its horizon scanning of where risks are coming from. But these are still TBC, right? We still don't know what is going to be delivered, the extent to which that promise is fulfilled. And so I think, unfortunately, like my summary of where we are in those post-Brexit years is it's been unclear, it's been inconsistent, we have lacked a strategy. We are seen as a smaller nation and taken less seriously, even if the individual contributions of brilliant diplomats and brilliant programs, of course, still hold. So all is not lost. I think that foreign policy has become more reactive rather than strategic. If we look at the response to Afghanistan, if we look at the response to Ukraine, these were crises that were foreseeable and were foreseen. And evidently, the kind of fluidity and freedoms that were promised from an independent foreign policy away from the European Union have not come to fruition. And that flux that was triggered both by Brexit and by the merger has only harmed UK capabilities and role in the world.
Thank you very much, Kate. So many interesting points. Ben, would you like to come in here?
Yeah, thank you very much. As the disinterested outsider, I hope I'm outside enough to give you some insight, but close enough I can say it frankly and not politely. So from the outside looking in, I mean, what I see is some continuity, quite a bit of confusion, and some real signs of marginalization in British foreign policy. In terms of the continuities, I think the global Britain thread is evident. I think we do see sort of strong principled rhetoric on democracy, on open markets, on free trade, on building and reinforcing global partnerships. So at that level, I mean, global Britain is visible, if you like, from outside. However, there's only really very partial follow through on that. I think NATO is solid. The UK and NATO is solid. I think the UK at the UN is very strong. I think on the trade portfolio, it's still patchy and very unclear as to what you're doing and why you're doing it. I also think, frankly, there's some overreach evident here. I think the Indo-Pacific tilt lacks credibility, to be perfectly frank with you. I think it rather reminds me of Tony Blair's ethical foreign policy, long on PR and short on substance. So that's the continuity. In terms of the confusions, I just don't get it, but the UK just can't seem to drop the Brexit bone. You talk about partnerships in Europe while burning through UK credibility on the Northern Ireland Protocol, on the withdrawal agreement. You know, it's impossible to conceptualize a global Britain which fails to fulfill its basic treaty obligations. That's just extraordinary to my mind. And it's visible and people witness it. And we see it almost on, well, prior to Ukraine, we saw it on a nearly daily basis. I have to also reference Prime Minister Johnson's comparison of Brexit with Ukraine's fight for its life, both profoundly ignorant and deeply offensive. You know, we read your newspapers, we watch your television, we see this nonsense, and it really comes across extraordinarily badly. playing to the Conservative Party backbenches just shreds UK's global credibility. Now, on the Indo-Pacific, I think there are obvious wins and possibilities here. An FTA with India is an obvious win-win for the UK. But even there, you don't see coherence in tactics or strategy. You see Westminster at odds in terms of its immigration goals, in terms of its trade goals, in terms of geostrategic goals. And you also, and I referenced, Kate's conversation about development, the gutting of UK development research. Again, an extraordinary misstep, which again is very, very visible and very, very tangible, and was a marker of UK excellence, and has now effectively disappeared from the field. My final point is on marginalization. I think obviously the UK remains a global player. From my perspective, I think it's somewhat diminished as a result of Brexit, but still a significant player on significant global issues. But the UK, honestly, I think is increasingly seen as an add-on and an afterthought. Richard referenced, this sovereigntist, I don't know if I pronounce the word properly, the sovereigntism of UK foreign policy. I have to tell you, coming from a small state, I recognize that. That fetishization of flags and status and position comes straight from the deep insecurities of being a small country. Because you're desperate for recognition, you're desperate to be seen, you're anxious that others would treat you as you would wish to be treated. That's small state insecurity. That's not what the UK was 10 years ago. But that kind of small state insecurity really does permeate a lot of what we see coming out of the UK. And this is an anecdote, this isn't a data point, but just looking at the coverage in this country of the Ukraine crisis. Hypothetically, had the UK remained within the EU, there would be huge coverage here of what the British Prime Minister was doing, what the British MOD was doing within the EU to push the EU, to push the collective action. It is extraordinary to me how little attention now Irish media gives what the UK is talking or doing about Ukraine. We're concerned about what Warsaw is doing, what Berlin is doing, what Paris is doing, even what Riga is doing over what is happening in London. So my summation, if I have to give you a tagline, is UK British foreign policy is a poor hand being played badly.
Thank you, Ben. Let's go straight to the war in Ukraine. Because, this has been a wake-up call for a lot of people, for, any foreign policy across the globe. So how do you assess the role of British foreign policy in the early stages of the crisis, the run-up to the invasion, and now that the war is going on and in a way is becoming more and more brutal? What has the UK done differently or better or worse than its allies, including EU member states? Kate, would you like to start on this one? And then we can go to Ben and Richard.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, on the one hand, we've seen this extraordinary outpouring of support for and solidarity with Ukraine and Ukrainians from the public, in the press, from parliamentarians across the political spectrum, even from businesses. We've actually seen a proactive response to pulling out business sometimes from Russia, or thinking about how they can fund, these kind of, sometimes they're performative, but for performative solidarity is also sometimes indicative of a wider mood. This hasn't really been matched by the UK government, but I think that this is for two reasons. One is because of sort of the reasons that I was talking before, is the lack of strategy. They don't have a strategy on conflict and atrocity and mass atrocities. So how are they going to respond? And because they're still in flux. Still, the Foreign Office and DFID haven't been reconciled. And some of it is political. And so those, where that waiting lies, I think is probably for negotiation and discussion. But it was too slow to respond. And I was struck by Liz Truss giving evidence to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee a week or so ago on the UK's response to Ukraine, where she was emphatic that she and HMG knew that this invasion was coming months ago. And I thought, and yet you made no preparations for what we knew was going to be a violent strategy that was driven and implemented by the commission of widespread human rights violations, war crimes, and very likely crimes against humanity, because we know that that's how Putin operates. We know that is his military political strategy, whether in Grozny, whether in Aleppo. We know this to be true. And yet none of those learnings, although that sounds a very euphemistic word to use, were put into what the UK did. And that to me is problematic. We know that the pathology of the kinds of crimes that Putin and his forces are committing is different to conventional hierarchical armed conflict. And the HMG knows this, which is why they've recognized they need to prioritize its strategy on atrocities and have a new approach to modern conflict, but it's not there yet. However, even the tools that the UK government has had at its disposal that it has policy for and are in theory easiest to deploy, it has been slow on. And just to pick two, sanctions and its approach to refugees. And taking the second first, let's note that the hateful borders bill was passed this afternoon, just minutes practically before we joined onto this call, which raises a standard of what is acceptable, what is acceptable for the state structures to do to the most vulnerable in the UK, the most vulnerable around the world, and essentially it impacts all of us. And so at the same time, we're having this debate about solidarity for Ukrainians, and Liz Truss says nothing is off the table. That bill says things are off the table. We were very, very slow to get moving on getting vulnerable Ukrainians out. And that is even knowing, in the Foreign Secretary's own words, that we knew that this was coming. And even those agencies that were there were not prepared to fully deliver, either on a practical sense of kind of like how the visas worked, or to catch the most vulnerable at risk. And so whether that is African and Arab citizens who are in Ukraine who are falling through the cracks, whether that is Roma populations, whether that, that's happened. Sanctions, our sanctions policy the sanctions policy, which goes back to the Brexit point, which because now the UK has its own independent sanctions regime, of which Dominic Raab was very proud of, has been slow, inefficient, and we're now in fact tethering ourselves as a state to what the EU and America is doing first, and then still not going as far. And so overall, it's just not been good enough. And so I think, if I'm allowed to just make a couple of quick pleas to what could be done, because it's very easy for us to sit in our comfortable chairs here and say, in the face of a really cataclysmic crisis, oh, you've done a bad job. There are things that I think carry on from the earlier question that you asked that could be done. One is thinking really carefully about strategic diplomatic leadership and not replicating the same mistakes that the UK, together with the US and France, and sometimes the European Union, have made in the face of these crises that are seminal, that breakthrough. And whether that is Libya, whether that is Syria, for different reasons, the UK, France, and the US, and often the European Union, have decided to work together and not seek a more global coalition or more global legitimacy. Russia is a P5 country, and we need that. And I think that General Assembly vote, where Russia was only able to get Belarus, Syria, and North Korea, was incredibly symbolic and should be capitalized on. We should be reaching out, the UK, to our partners in order to make sure that we are setting a global standard, and we're able to take advantage of the fact that finally, after 20 years of impunity in the face of rising violence against civilians, that finally we've had a sense of raising expectations of what the international community should do around international humanitarian law and so on. You know, Kenya's speech at the General Assembly regarding sovereignty was phenomenal. That should be centered in this strategy. The second is having the ability to map what the UK actually can do. The UK currently lacks the capabilities to map its levers of influence over Russia. And so therefore its sanctions and its diplomatic engagement is kind of ad hoc. It's very responsive. Map the architectures of violence, of where it comes from, whether that is military, whether that's communications, whether that's where the money is, whether that's organized crime. That's the kind of stuff that intelligence agencies do. It's a more American way of informing sanctions. And so, you know, those are my two kind of pleas. And just to go back to the integrated review for a second, in this promise of what Global Britain was and what the integrated review promised, you know, it said it would look at this new form of violence, and it would look specifically at atrocity crimes. Putin has driven his foreign policy by the commission, enablement, or perpetration of these crimes. And it is, to me, unforgivable that we are unprepared at this stage, and that crisis team doesn't have those expertise. And so, yeah, I stopped there. I mean, I don't have much good news on that front, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. But I think that your point about, you know, capitalizing on the diplomatic leadership, and if I can add, you know, the capacity to build alliances, you know, should definitely figure higher on the list of on the to-do list, so to say. Ben.
Yeah, thanks very much. From my perspective, I think British foreign policy on the Russian war on Ukraine really has exemplified some extraordinary UK strengths. Which have been superlative on, for example, defense and security, on the supply of defensive weapons to Ukraine, on, as Richard referenced earlier on, the commitment on the Joint Expeditionary Force with Poland and the Baltic states, with the UK's role in NATO. So all of that, you know, serious, substantive, substantial, and important. There have also been some terrific rhetorical flourishes. Some great speeches, some great rhetoric, some, you know, real sort of bulldog kind of touches. But then the weaknesses almost immediately reasserted themselves. The British weaknesses on migration, the British weaknesses on chasing Russian money in the City of London. I mean, really, I mean, just dreadful stuff, people, just absolutely dreadful, and seem to be, you know, comparing, you know, even where the UK is with Cyprus in terms of dependence on that Russian money and unwillingness to chase it down. And I think, sorry, but for me, I think the migration has been the worst aspect of it. The really, really slow start, the abject confusion between great departments of state as to what you were doing, how you were doing it, misinformation in Parliament on what was happening and what was being done. It was just egregious. And just one tiny illustration of that, as you may or may not be aware, because we share a common travel area with the UK, Ireland is not part of the Schengen Agreement. So we still had visa restrictions on all Ukrainians coming to Ireland. You know, at the outset of the invasion, Ireland dropped all visa restrictions, offered 3-year working visas to all Ukrainian citizens, irregardless of status. And by, I think it was last weekend, we had upwards of 5,500–6,000 Ukrainian refugees in the Republic, compared to, I think at that time, 800 in the UK. So not only do you have the disparity in terms of responsiveness and treatment, but we also got complaints from the UK, reported in our local press, complaints from the UK that we had dropped the visa requirements, that we were exposing the UK by virtue of our common travel area, we were exposing the UK to security threats because we weren't vetting, you know, destitute mothers and children at the port of Calais or on the planes coming in. Again, it's an anecdote, it's not a data point, but it just exemplifies the differentiation of response, particularly on that really, really important issue of migration. Thanks.
Thank you. No, that's very, very visible as well. Richard.
I don't really want to repeat, the points that Ben and Kate have made, and I think they're all very well made. But maybe just to make three observations. I think, Kate's point about the lack of joined upness, I think is an important one, because the UK spent some time, supposedly building an infrastructure. We, National Security Council and all that. We're supposed to be thinking across departments of state. We're supposed to have mechanisms in place to coordinate, to respond, and so on. And clearly, there's been a systemic failure, I think, of this as a major order foreign security and defense policy challenge. And the sort of bits of the system that have tended to work better have been the kind of politico-security bits, the bits in and around the MOD, where you've had this longer standing relationship with Ukraine. And I think, what I worry about a little bit is, yes, and thank you, Ben, the UK, has done some things very well, I think. And I think you could say that it's sort of the sagacity of the analysis on Russia in the integrated review, can give the government some comfort, if you like, that it was able so clearly to identify what kind of threat Russia represented. But having that capacity, having that quality of analysis, and having that sort of foresight to think about how Ukraine fits within that response to Russia. The loss has been being outside the EU diplomatic system is that, that couldn't be conveyed as effectively as otherwise might have been the case in the past. And the UK's strengths that could have been balanced with other member state strengths, particularly, bordering states when it comes to the reception of refugees and so on, that's not possible any longer for the UK outside the EU. So the things that it's weak on really stand out as being things that it's weak on. And these in some way detract attention from the things that it's rather better on and rather stronger on. But I think, one thing that, maybe is a small bright spot is that we've seen over Russia and we've seen over Ukraine the rebuilding of a cross-party consensus in Parliament on foreign and security policy issues, which had completely broken down, I think, through Brexit. Although saying that, it's, one of the things I found particularly difficult to stomach on the Prime Minister's remarks at the weekend. I mean, the things that he said at the front end of his speech were pretty crass. But what he had to say at the end about the opposition, sort of raising the white flag and so on, were pretty distasteful. I think, and completely inappropriate when you've had this. Essentially, the opposition has sort of lent support to the government on its Russia policy, and I think that's rather inexcusable. But then also, to me, begs the question as to how easy it's going to be for the UK to get back to sort of cross-party consensus on core issues and core concerns, and how far something like the integrated review, which is, as Kate says, is flawed, but at least it had the value of sort of bringing things together and thinking about UK's security as a package. I mean, that's not going to have a sort of cross-party buy-in, I think, because of the way that the government is handling some of these issues. So, it's not just a concern for now, if you like, but it's also a concern for, how you build the appropriate muscle memory in Parliament for making sure that we do have a strong cross-party consensus on a Russia policy, which is clearly essential, not least for the reason that Ben picked up on, which is it's had a corrosive impact on our domestic political system because we haven't taken the necessary measures to safeguard our politics from the influence of Russian money.
Thank you, Richard. I know that there are questions coming up in the chat, and I look forward to more questions, more comments, and to giving a say to the audience that has been very patient so far. But I would like to just ask you one last question before we move to the Q&A, which is on the mid to long term perspective, especially in terms of security, because we see that the security regime in Europe is changing dramatically, is shifting. The EU and its member states are rethinking their strategies. The EU has published its strategic compass yesterday, and it mentions the UK, but only to say that we remain open to engage with the UK on security and defense. What is the UK doing? What can we expect? Have you got a crystal ball that we can press into service at this point? Should we start with Ben?
Thanks, Federica. I think my crystal ball is a bit dusty. Have to take it out of the darkened cupboard. To be honest, I think on this question I'm most hopeful because there's huge scope, opportunity, and possibility. I would underscore the sense that from the EU's perspective, we've witnessed a revolution in policy over the last number of weeks. To see 30 or 40 years of German foreign security defense policy reversed, of a Sunday morning at 72 hours notice has been extraordinary. I mean, Federica, you and I, and Richard in particular, have been looking at the EU for decades now. The prospect of what we've seen was unimaginable a month ago. So it is beyond change, it's a revolution. The potential for that, obviously in terms of revolution, is opportunity. And I think there is huge opportunity. I think the European Union's door is wide open to the UK to work with the UK in terms of what the European Union is doing. But our agenda is moving so far, so fast, so furiously in terms of the operationalization of the European Peace Facility, in terms of the European Defence Fund, in terms now of this 5,000 rapid reaction force. Now, caveat, we were supposed to have a rapid reaction force in 1999, so I'm not going to bet my house on the rapid reaction force. But just in terms of the scale and scope of what's going on, it's enormous. And there's huge opportunity to work with the UK on that. My fear is, admixed always with the hope, is that the UK, because of its domestic Brexit obsessions, simply will not be there, will not be willing to engage, as we have seen up to date in terms of the security defense agenda. I also have to emphasize, and I'll finish on this point, I also have to emphasize that we are in a uniquely beneficial moment, having someone in the White House who is a confirmed Atlanticist. In 32 months' time, we could be welcoming back President Trump. Or worse still, we could be welcoming back someone smarter than Trump, but working to Trump's agenda. That will expose the underbelly weaknesses and inconsistencies of European security defense policy in a cruel and harsh manner. And where the UK will stand on that, where the UK will work on that, will be really, really critical to European security and defense and to the UK security and defense. And sorry, the final point there. One of the potential dangers here is simply because of NATO's revivification and the now proximity of the European Union and NATO working damn near hand in glove, threatens the possibility of leaving the UK out in precisely the same way that Turkey is out. And again, it's a fear of marginalization. But I genuinely think the opportunity is in the UK's hands if it chooses to take it.
Thank you. Richard.
Thank you very much. I mean, of course, the UK is a world leader, and I'm sure it's a world leader on crystal balls as well as everything else. But my own view, maybe just on four issues, and this overlaps with Ben community. I mean, the first is, let's think about Russia. I mean, Russia now has taken on, I think, for Europeans, the challenge of containment, right? And if we think back to containment as originally pursued in the aftermath of the Second World War, the early Cold War. It had societal, it had political, it had economic as well as military dimensions. And clearly, there is an organization, NATO, which takes care of some of the security and the military aspects. But the EU is really important for the societal and the political and the economic. So, you have to have a connectivity, and the UK has to have a connectivity with a major European organization that's going to be an important part of the post-war in Ukraine containment of Russia. Right? Secondly, and I agree with Ben, the point he's made very well on transatlantic relations. It's not so long ago in the autumn that we were all worrying about the Biden administration after the withdrawal from Afghanistan and so on. And clearly, the weather has changed quite significantly. But the UK and other European states share the same interest in managing the transatlantic relationship in a way which is agreeable for all of those states. And in some ways, it's more acute for the UK because we suffer from this neurosis in terms of our relationship with the US, which leads to some strange contortions, sometimes as happened under President Trump. So, transatlantic relationship and how it works is important for all of us. And I don't see a sort of UK-European, continental European divide on that. Third point, strategic autonomy and European sovereignty. And with some colleagues at Chatham House, it seems like a lifetime ago, but in February, we wrote a piece on how important it was for the UK to think hard about strategic autonomy and where it fits. I think it's even more important now. And actually, there's a very happy coincidence, I think, on the broader definition, the European sovereignty end of strategic autonomy, because that chimes completely with the kind of things that the UK set out in the integrated review in terms of science and technology base and all that. So, that cries out for an understanding and a way of working together, which is to mutual benefit. And I think maybe we should draw a distinction, as Ben has done, on the defence aspects of that as well, because I think they're more problematic for the UK being more detached. But it will almost certainly push the idea of a European pillar within NATO as a sort of competing proposition as well. So, we could well see competing models, but maybe that's one for the Q&A. 1.5 points, and I'll finish. The tilt hasn't gone away for the UK. And one may think it's a delusion, one may think it's an overstretch of resources, but it's pretty integral to the way that the UK thought about how it's going to connect the Euro-Atlantic with the Indo-Pacific. And a couple of weekends ago, there was this joint US-UK get-together on the Indo-Pacific. And what's clear is that it matters quite a lot to the UK, but it's going to be a less than effective policy if, and that's my half point, the UK pursues that policy in a way that rubs up other countries in the wrong way. Read France. And this is where I see a problem that the UK has, which is possibly going to be a persistent problem, which is in its bilateral relationship with France, which could get even worse. If you can imagine such a thing, but a re-elected President Macron and a Prime Minister Johnson still in power, that is not a match made in heaven. And the UK may be rather disconcerted with what Germany does on defence. The UK likes the idea, and it's one of its top lines, as they say in media speak, that it is the big spender on defence. And if Germany becomes the big spender on defence, then what does that do to the UK's thinking about the position that it occupies as a defence spender? We're talking quite a way down the track, of course, because there's all sorts of things that could happen to disrupt Germany's new spend on defence and how it spends the money and so on. But that triadic relationship, UK, France and Germany, could be even more difficult in the future than it's been in the recent past. And so if the UK puts a lot of store in that relationship being quite important to the way that it connects to the continent, then it makes the UK's European policy even more difficult. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. There are all sorts of ways that just by mood and saying the right kind of things that you could see a major improvement in the relationship between the UK and other EU partners. But the current government seems to have a propensity to go out and punch people in the face diplomatically without needing to do so.
Thank you. Well, I mean, we have a lovely stream of questions coming in, and if you thought that I was, too direct, you're going to hear from our audience. They're going to put you on the spot, and it's lovely to see some familiar names there. One is Benjamin Tallis from Heritage School in Berlin, who asks,
am I able to come back on that question? Am I able to come back on that last third question?
For a one-liner.
Okay, I mean, I don't need to, that's fine.
Yeah, can you wave it into the debate? I'm sure that there are many points are coming back in the Q&A, I can see. So question from Benjamin Tallis from Heritage School, Berlin. Does the oh, sorry. No, you're right. Absolutely, Kate. I skipped you. I thought that I gave you the word. Oh, sorry. My crystal ball, I mean, is doing really a bad job. Kate, go ahead.
No, I thought maybe I'd already used my allotted time, and they're like, no, we've had enough. Don't worry, we don't need any more. I know, when I ask, because to me, this is where we're able to think about the positive bits. We're able to think about the opportunity, and I think that the devastation of what we're seeing in Ukraine, and very likely will continue to see, has already triggered such an extraordinary shift that Ben and Richard have already kind of mentioned, that it allows for a reset, not just in UK's foreign policy, but actually in international relations more broadly. I don't think that we have seen, even in these past few weeks, such an outpouring of consensus and outcry in response to a human rights crisis. I think probably since the wars in former Yugoslavia and the atrocities in Bosnia. I always thought that it would come with Syria, but it never did. And what came out of the atrocities and the failure to protect populations in former Yugoslavia, and particularly in Bosnia, was something of a global reset. And of course, together with the horrors of what happened in Rwanda in 1994, and that led to a raising of expectations on and off the international community, of which the UK was an important part. It gave us the unanimous commitment to a responsibility to help protect populations from atrocity crimes. And we can debate, the extent to which R2P itself as a principle has been forefront in global relations in the last 25 years. 16 years since it came out, but the principle that drove it was older than that, or not. But it had a wider impact in international relations, and it had a wider impact that is harder to measurable. It's more qualitative than quantitative in how the UK for some time was thinking about obligations, and also how the public thinks about its obligations. We are seeing a similar push forward around Ukraine that allows the UK government to, and I actually think rather than an opportunity, it is actually an obligation, to think quite seriously about how it can bring in its commitments around rights and around values into its foreign policy. I'm obviously a human rights activist and researcher. I will, demand more consistency. I know that practically that is not always going to be delivered, but they currently lack the means of making that assessment. What Russia's aggression also does is that it exposes what was always there of this relationship between foreign policy threats and global threats and British interests here in the UK and in the world in a very, very clear manner. And I think that brings an impetus to really recognize that the relationship between rights and values and foreign policy are not distinct. human rights was always something that was just added on a little bit by DFID and a little bit by FCO, some training in the MOD, and it fell through the cracks. And to some extent, you know, the biggest foreign policy challenges that the UK face now and will face are to some extent a result of not just British failure, but a collective failure to recognize the deep relationship between rights and foreign policy and the need to explore that, even in recognizing that there are going to be always inconsistencies, and that is a difficult thing to do. We look at China, we look at Russia, we look at India. These are the challenges that the UK needs to be prepared for. We look at climate change, the consequences of climate change, that even if everything stops today, the consequences that are already locked in to our heating planet are so dramatic that we will see the biggest population movements. We will see increase of armed violence, both of conflict and against groups, that actually that kind of mass violence will characterize the next political era unless something is dramatically changed. So I think if we are able collectively, whether as researchers or whether sort of as activists, whether as NGO, whether as government, to think about how those raised expectations can be properly met, I think that that is going to be really important. And I note that both Ben and Richard alluded to changing administrations or the potential for changing administrations in the US. We have a general election here in the UK within 2 years. I know we're so exhausted by them. Is this the longest we've gone without one? I have no idea. There will be a general election, and I think that you know, there is going to be a conversation where the Labour Party has to determine its foreign policy, and I don't think that that has been very clear for some time. And perhaps the reinvigorated conversation after long years of vacuum around UK foreign policy might trigger something quite interesting from the Labour Party. But unfortunately, I do think that that remains to be seen. But I'll stop there. Thank you for letting me come in on that.
No, thank you. It was a very important point, and definitely one that we should keep in mind about this possibility to rethink obligations and kind of, you know, have a good and hard look at what we do and how we do it. So, as I said, Benjamin Tallis from Hertie School Berlin asks, does the panel agree that British domestic policy, notably on migration, undermines its global aspirations? Would it be fair to say that the UK can have a network of liberty or a hostile environment, but not both? Then we have a question from, and apologies for my pronunciation, Arianna Srivastava, a student at Ashoka University, India. How should UK foreign policy deal with the rising tide of authoritarianism and with it the rise of China? Should it align with the USA's hardline policy with regard to China, or should UK's foreign policy open up even more to Chinese investment and vice versa? And a third question, last one for this round, from Poom, one of my students, a master's student in international relations at LSE, who asks, do you think that this reorientation toward European security could restrict the UK from doing anything meaningful anywhere east of Suez, beyond symbolic actions, despite its global ambitions? Right, back to you, panelists. Richard, would you like to have a go? And, you know, you don't need to answer everything, but, you know, give it a good stab.
Thank you very much. What I want to do, if I may, is I'll take that last question about the Indo-Pacific. And Ben Tallis, who's a very productive questioner, I can see, also asked another question about the Indo-Pacific tilt as well. So I get to sort of tackle two interventions with one. You know, I think this tilt question is a fascinating one because it is both a direct response, and the Prime Minister made this very clear, a direct response to what was thought to be a mistake in Britain's calculations about its geopolitical footprint, which is the end of east of Suez bases. And he said this very clearly. So there is a certain amount sort of back to the future in UK thinking about the tilt. And I think it's a bit instructive to go back to that history, because if you look at the Cabinet Office papers, when they made the decision to pull back and to stop basing British forces east of Suez, they faced a choice, which was basically, could they afford to contribute to wholeheartedly contribute to their role as a Euro-Atlantic power and the role that they had in NATO and keep their nuclear deterrent, or how could they balance it with what they did east of Suez? They couldn't do both, so they decided to pull back and focus on Europe, because that was the core UK interest, and keeping the nuclear deterrent. And you know, I guess the question is, will that choice come up for the UK in the future? Maybe, but something like AUKUS is quite interesting, because you know, AUKUS isn't a traditional military alliance type relationship. It's a relationship on technology sharing as a way to introduce a role for the UK in that region, which otherwise clearly, you know, the balance of forces are such that it can't make much of a difference, even if it has a persistent presence in terms of its naval power. So, you know, I think that this is one of these areas where time is going to tell. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about, yes, you know, the UK needs to have a position on the Indo-Pacific, but doing it on its own, it's clearly not possible. And the point that Ben makes is, would it not be better for the UK to focus on Europe and then free up a bit of space for the US to do more in the Indo-Pacific? I think the short answer is yes. But the problem is that it goes against the idea that, again, I think it's hardwired into the integrated review, that the UK has to think big and has to look as if it's tackling everything globally. And the bit that's really missing for me in that document, and I hope that future iterations will sort it out, is how do you build coalitions? The kind of things that Liz Truss has been talking about, but in using better language, frankly. And how do you really build these kind of coalitions where you have shared values, and why you're coalescing is not necessarily to address security threats in a sort of military security threat sense, but because, you know, you see these values as being absolutely integral to the best way that you provide for the security of your populations and for your nation. And I think that's one of the things that gets lost with some of the messaging that the UK comes forward. So, but great questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kate, so that I don't forget you.
Thank you. I think I'll take that middle question around the rising tide of authoritarianism. This is something that we look at a lot at protection approaches and are really concerned by. It's linked, I think, to a really global trend of something slightly wider than that of democratic backsliding, where we're seeing in sort of practically every region of the world these indicators that suggest or can measure the openness of a society, the safety and inclusion of the society, the degree to which the press is free and true, and the institutions are trusted, that the democratic process in its most kind of, well, not its most, but a more generous understanding and interpretation of what it means rather than a very narrow one is allowed to flourish. And we can see indications of democratic backsliding here in the UK. And what we see in these kind of dual relationships of rising authoritarianism and democratic backsliding is a tendency towards identity politics and that kind of factional development away from broad-based democratic process and political parties towards a kind of fractured democratic space, the undermining of the multilateral system, the undermining of kind of legal and normative standards, both on the international level and on the domestic and regional level, wherever we're talking about. And I suppose this goes to sort of those threats that I was mentioning earlier, that we see particularly in China and Russia, but also I think, you know, what we're seeing in India is extremely concerning. You know, I was having conversations earlier today with colleagues who were essentially seeing sort of these steps towards, and I don't say this lightly, but these steps towards a highly organized, systematic campaign of identity-based violence against Muslims in India and of other minorities that has yet to even really properly feature or be acknowledged in UK trade relationships and conversations with India. The UK will also pay the price of not using this opportunity to try and use those levers it can to have those conversations. I don't say that as if it's an easy thing to do, but because the UK lacks these capabilities to map properly the networks that underpin these structures of violence, state and non-state, because authoritarian creep often is kind of led from the front, but it is enabled and fueled from below and from other structures. And it might often be there that the UK can sort of help with others play that part to help mitigate that trend and that trajectory. But also the easiest answer, or I mean easy in principle, of what the UK can do in front of this rising tide is to lead by example, to not undermine its own standards and its own legislative and normative standards, and to recognize how our own democratic processes, whether in Parliament, our own democratic institutions, or the institutions that allow democracy to flourish in this country, are protected and supported rather than undermined and teared down sometimes by the elected leaders themselves. So that neither of those strategies are easy, but there are certainly many things that the UK can do, and it needs to inbuild into its bilateral country strategies the understanding of those warning signs of authoritarianism in countries which are perhaps less further along and where there is more capacity for British influence, because those are currently not done, and should be. And the IR kind of hinted that it might be done, but so far we're not there yet.
Thank you. Ben, you're left with the question, you know, about the tension between migration and global aspiration. I think that could be something that you might want to comment on.
Well, I'll take your direction, and I shall leverage that to add on to what Kate was just saying, because that connect between the domestic and the foreign, I think, is really important, and the disconnect that is evident in all countries. I mean, it's not a unique UK problem, but that disconnect is really important. And I think, I mean, to be very frank with you, and as I say, I'm riffing now off Kate's answer. You know, if there was to be a Brexit benefit, and I don't think there is, but if there was to be a Brexit benefit in my mind's eye, what I'd love to see is the EU and UK competing on a human rights-led agenda, showing up each other's hypocrisy, being, you know, testing out new ways of doing things that challenge the other partner to do things better. Because we all know there's a lot of rhetoric, there's not a lot of follow through, there's a lot of historical inconsistencies there. And I think there is an opportunity here for the UK, bearing in mind where it comes from. If we can bracket its imperialism and its neocolonialism just for a moment, there's a huge reservoir of tradition, of history, of policy that the UK could leverage in a foreign policy that was devoted to democracy, to human rights, to a normative-led kind of foreign policy, which could really show up the European Union in terms of its own policies on human rights and on migration. And you'd love to see sort of virtuous competition between these two values-led actors in the international sphere. My fear is, coming back to the question you asked me to answer, my fear is that I don't know that the domestic politics of the UK could sustain it.
Thank you. Second round, we start from, again, apologies for my pronunciation, Luca Auger, PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris, who asks, comments and then asks, the UK's slower response in comparison to the US and EU is known in expert circles and in the foreign press. Still, the UK government claims it was faster, especially than the EU. How far does the British public adhere to this view? And what does this say about the UK's general post-Brexit position towards the EU? I think that this point about the British public and how much they buy into the UK government's claim is quite an important one. There is also an interesting point made by Leonardo De Agostini, who is working in Brussels in a conflict prevention NGO. And he says that he has to note that the UK, rather than being invited to relevant discussions, is often left outside the room. From my daily advocacy activities with EU policymakers to Prime Minister Johnson being excluded from next Thursday's EU Council with President Biden. Does this point to a very real diminished role for the UK in European foreign policy? And last one, from Callie Lewis, another one of my students, delighted to see Callie from Wales. To what extent do you think current foreign policy failures are uniquely partisan, given the Conservatives have now been in power for 12 years? Do you think Labour is offering a credible alternative, or I'll add, can it offer a credible alternative? Right, back to you guys. Who would like to start and include a sort of a one line of a final comment at leisure? Shall we go with Kate first and then Ben and Richard?
Sure. I'm going to take the Labour question just for fun. I mean, certainly it can offer a credible alternative. Whether it is right now, I don't know if it is. In fact, I don't think it is. And that might be for like really strategic Labour, you know, sort of party reasons. But I do think that there is this assumption that elections aren't won on foreign policy issues, even despite all we've been talking about for however many years is Brexit, which is a foreign policy issue and has fundamentally changed everything. I also think that the British public care a far greater deal about how the UK behaves in the world than is generally accepted. I mean, we've done public polling on this, and so have many other people. Our most recent was a couple of years ago, because we haven't done anything since COVID. One of the things I found really interesting was around identity and the sense of belonging that we found. People who are over 45 in the UK generally consider themselves to be, English, Welsh, you know, they sort of have a kind of sense of this national identity and to feel themselves part of the UK. But they tend not to consider themselves to be European or part of a global community. Under 45, that sense of national identity is not diluted, but they also really very strongly consider themselves to be part of a global community and to be European. There is some inflection around those that voted to leave the European Union and not, but even those younger people that voted to leave the EU still consider themselves to be, you know, more international. We know that the British public think that the UK has responsibilities abroad, as Ukraine has really demonstrated, as Afghanistan demonstrated. The public outcry and the public warmth towards the trauma that Afghanistan was going towards and the anger, is something that should be noted, even if it did not trigger a response from the government, particularly, again, going back to the point around migration and refugees, that I think, you know, it was obligated to deliver. So I say all that because I really do think that the political party that is able to capture that energy, to capture that more global identity, you know, we are a more connected world, I really think actually can make quite significant and substantial electoral gains it's not to say it's more important, but these issues that we're talking about around climate change, around disinformation, around the role of Russia in Europe, around the UK and the world, who we trade with, they resonate here domestically in the UK. You know, the Borders and Nationality Bill is about people in the UK as well as those who are seeking sanctuary here. So I think Labour certainly can. I would like to see that warming up pretty soon, given that, you know, we are coming up to election cycle soon anyway. But I don't think it currently is, no.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll leave the domestic British to Kate and Richard. I'll pick up the Eurobubble question. I mean, Leonardo, you're right, but I would say, you know, you make reference to the UK, you know, being left outside the room. You talk about Prime Minister Johnson being excluded from the European Council. You know, the UK walked out. They're not being excluded. They walked out. And I think the European Union has repeatedly said, you know, doors are open to come up with a new kind of security and defense relationship, which I think would benefit both sides. I think all the logic is there for the European Union and the UK to cooperate in security and defense, on human rights, in development. There's a whole menu of potential cooperation, but the UK can't or won't walk through that door. And this, if you like, is my final summation, and it's quite a graphic image. It's almost like the rotten fish of Brexit still hangs around the neck of British foreign policy. And for reasons which escape me entirely, the nature of domestic British politics will not let the British political system let that go. And so for as long as UK foreign policy is grounded, is tempered by, is corrupted by these Brexit debates that you seem to still be going through, I don't see any great hope or expectation of change in the short to medium term. And I will vest my hopes in your imminent general election.
Richard, public opinion for you and final thoughts.
I mean, Kate's made the point, a very good point about sort of polling and what we understand about the values of the electorate and so on, and also made the point about, you know, foreign policy having a very low level of salience in general elections, as did Europe, of course. It wasn't an issue that moved people until the last general election, arguably. But I think also the thing that has changed is clearly there are issues which were not foreign policy in the past, which are now absolutely foreign policy and end up on people's doorstep, like climate change. And people spend a lot of time worrying about foreign policy now, even if they don't know they're worrying about foreign policy. And I think that's a positive in a way, because it opens the door to a more inclusive foreign policy for the UK. And that's, to me, is in a way the sort of the way in which I'd kind of not be too depressed by what Ben says, which I think you're right. You know, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to shake off Brexit for the UK, because we're cleaved and we remain cleaved if you look at all of the polling on that. And the only way we're going to find our way around it is to think about you know, the way in which the UK connects outside and try in a way to recalibrate the thinking about Europe. So it isn't this thing which is always about the domestic political cleavage. It isn't all about an identity that still is important for some people, you know, 5 years on from a referendum, almost 6 years on, that we're able to have a bit more of an open and honest conversation about what is in the UK's interests in terms of how the UK relates to Europe, because it's connected to these other issues that we've been talking about, you know, values in foreign policy, the environment and all that. But I have to say, I really love the idea of some kind of sort of normative power UK clashing with normative power Europe, and the tussle from the both of those resulting in something better for both sides. I mean, that, you know, that's the future that we should all vote for, I think, rather than the present that we have.
Thank you. Now it is up to me to mop up everything else that has been put in the chat, and that's quite a daunting task. I mean, for the record, I have been passed on question from our super helpful assistants in the department, and now that I scrolled down the list of Q&A, we could be here for another hour, and maybe, you know, there is a room for a follow-up debate at some point. But I would like to just make a couple of points. The first one is addressed to George Foden, who comments on the fact that we have been a bit depressing and in our analysis. And I think that much of our depressing analysis is actually linked to the fact that we all have very high expectations and knowledge of what the UK can do. And therefore, it becomes frustrating to see how a lot of good contributions that the UK could make get lost in what has been mentioned from the disjointed response to the war in Ukraine that Ben mentioned, to the fundamental inconsistencies that Kate mentioned at the beginning, and therefore it seems to me that, you know, there are opportunities out there, as Richard mentioned, in terms of, you know, connecting to European countries in order to manage the post-Ukraine containment of Russia, in building up the European pillar in NATO. But there are also, you know, there is the need to strategize and to rethink. Anyway, this is probably the exciting part, you know, how to do it. And I have to admit that I kind of I see also the point that Amit Neufeld mentions at one point about the UK just stop getting involved in foreign affairs and focus on building UK domestic politics. But at the same time, I also see that the UK has a lot to contribute to managing a world order that is a little bit more just and fair, and it would be a shame not to exploit the expertise that is there, from, you know, the military side to the digital side, to participation in institutions, to the, you know, vibrant discussion in the civil society. I mean, it would be a shame not to use this opportunity to come up with a bit of a clearer plan, because I think that one of the conclusions of tonight's debate is that we are all still waiting to see the precise direction this is going to. Due to the war in Ukraine, in a way, everyone is reassessing foreign policies and trying to understand the future and what it has in store. I think that in a way, the bottom line of today is really to be continued. Let the debate take place at some point soon again, because it is only by debating that we can shape our own ideas, suggest which opportunities to pick. And that's why I am extremely grateful to our panelists, but also to our audience and to all the comments and questions that they have put in the chat. We will keep up the good conversation, and hopefully at some point we will be able to see a clearer direction in British foreign policy. Thank you very much, everyone.